tell you what, I'm gonna tell you. I'm gonna tell you what, I'm gonna tell you. I'm gonna tell you what, I'm gonna tell you. I'm gonna tell you what, I'm gonna tell you. I'm gonna tell you what.
Hey, how's it going? Welcome to Tell You What, the podcast. My name is Mike. We talk here about songwriting and the creative process. Our guest today is Rob Miller. Rob was a founder of Bloodshot Records, and he ran things there for almost 30 years. Rob wrote a great book about his journey to and through Bloodshot, the recently released The Hours Are Long, But the Pay is Low, A Curious Life in Independent Music. A little background on Bloodshot Records is in order here. Bloodshot was founded by Rob and a couple of partners in the mid-1990s here in Chicago. The organization was fiercely independent, focusing its efforts on artists and music that kind of fell between the lines of genre and category. Their artists famously blended the influences of country and punk, as well as rockabilly, folk, soul, and so on. They coined the term insurgent country to put a label on what they were doing. Some of the artists involved at Bloodshot were John Langford and the Waco Brothers, Nico Case, Justin Townes Earl, the Old 97s, Robbie Fulks, Kelly Hogan, Split Lip Brayfield, as well as a couple we have had here on the podcast, Jason Hawk Harris and the band Rookie. It is safe to say that the Americana roots music boom of the last 20 years, which is still very much underway, would have looked a lot different without the work of Rob Miller and Bloodshot Records. And as Rob discusses, the story of Bloodshot is also a story of the city of Chicago. He states clearly that he doesn't think this could have happened anywhere else, certainly not in the usual cultural hotspots on the East or West Coast. This is the first time I have had as a guest someone who is not primarily a musician, a songwriter. Why did I choose to have Rob on as a guest then? Well, firstly, because I can have whomever I want on the show. And I had a feeling this would be an engaging and fun conversation, and yes, indeed it was. But when I read Rob's book, I realized his story had a lot to offer. His work with the roots music scene has a lot of crossovers with the guests I have on the show. Secondly, as mentioned, Bloodshot is a real Chicago story. And as that is the home city of Tell You What Enterprises Incorporated, I knew a number of our listeners would have an interest. But there's a further reason. Rob is one of the unsung heroes that make the real music scene, the one that matters, happen. I often talk about how impressed I am by many of the artists I meet who are working in the roots, folk, country, Americana world. Most of them realize they will never make big money. They are instead driven by the passion they have for their craft, for their art. They have something to say, something to create, and they're willing to make real sacrifices to get that art out into the world. But it would not be possible for most of them to do so without the people who work behind the scenes to facilitate that. Sure, there is a terrible, large, corporate, profit-driven megaplex out there, making things difficult for 99% of the artists in the world. Don't forget about all the managers, agents, independent venue owners, small festival organizers, independent record labels, record and bookstores, and the occasional podcaster out there who are on the good side, whose whole motivation is to get the music of these great performers out there in front of people who will appreciate it. We would not get to hear and see many of these great artists were not for these generally unsung people doing the work to make that happen. To me, that is the real message of the story of Bloodshot Records, this book, and Rob Miller's work, and why I thought it was worth having Rob on the show. In case I haven't made it clear, this is a great book. Anyone who appreciates roots music, the city of Chicago, or just a well-put-together, witty, and compelling memoir should pick up a copy. And for now, please enjoy this Tell You What conversation with Rob Miller. How do you feel? You ready to go?
Sure.
All right, let's do this. Get my paperwork in order. Rob Miller, welcome to Tell You What, the podcast. Thank you for coming out to the Epiplex here in Evanston today.
Thanks for having me.
High above the muddy fields of Evanston. Welcome. You wrote a book, Rob, didn't you?
I did. The hours are long, but the pay is low.
Your first book, right?
It is, unless you count the Adventures of Glob and Snob, which was the hit of fourth grade elementary school. They loved that.
So your second book. So how does it feel having what I imagine was a long project in the making about to make its way out into the world?
It is an utterly alien experience for me. I spent the entirety of my, I guess you would call it professional, air quotes around that, my professional career working for and on behalf of others, mostly staying backstage to the side of the stage behind a computer,
right? All
that stuff. So to be kind of in the foreground is a little unusual, but it feels good so far.
Good. No, well, this is your first book. I'm not counting fourth grade. And this is my first time talking about a book on the podcast. So we will muddle through this together. Sound good?
All right.
I reached out to you because I really enjoyed this book. I found it compelling for several reasons. I've been looking forward to digging into this book with you and hearing more about your story. So we will get into the book itself in a minute, but let's talk about Rob, the writer and author. You've done some writing in your career before this, right? You've written about music. Talk about that a little bit. And were you comfortable taking on this project, confident in the skills you have to make a book?
Well, confident, that's a tricky word, but I spent a lot of time writing for fanzines and writing in college radio, helping write the program guide, and wrote some reviews, longer form reviews, show reviews in the Detroit equivalent of the Chicago Reader, the alternative magazine, and wrote some short stories and moved to Chicago and wrote for more fanzines and things. But I have never come anywhere close to something that is this long and this involved. And it was quite surprising how hard it was.
So anything in particular that you recall as being what made it so difficult?
Finding the good story arc. You don't have the luxury of writing 75 pages and then kind of moving on. You have to keep a consistent narrative voice, and your points that you are making on page 200 have to coincide with what you said 150 pages before that.
Yeah.
And you can't my first draft that I sent to a friend, one of the notes was, "You already made that joke." So you can't, just the close reading that you have to do over and over and over again. I now have newfound sympathy for bands who would turn in a finished record to me in the office and say, "I never want to hear this again. I never want to play these songs again. I'm ready for the next record." I actually sat down last night and read a couple chapters for the first time in several months. And I was like, okay, that's good. That's some pretty good stuff. And so just finding that it has to be consistent, and it can't ever be lazy, and it can't ever get dull. You have to keep people engaged.
Well, I'm going to read you the next sentence I have written down here in my notes. You just set me up. I said, "Your writing skills shine in this book. You have a great style, a strong, consistent style, witty, great detail, and the arc of the story is very well put together."
All right, let's wrap this up and go home.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
What you described as the hard parts are what stood out to me as what made it a good book. So well done.
Well, thank you very much.
In particular, I found your descriptive use of metaphor and simile to be really entertaining. Here's one of your great lines, and I think this has been quoted elsewhere. "The music business is not a meritocracy. It is a crapshoot taking place in a septic tank balanced on the prow of the Titanic, while 1,000 snarky know-it-alls pound on the bulkheads with baseball bats and keyboards." Now, as I might say to a songwriter I have on the podcast about a standout lyric, you must be kind of proud of that one.
I guess so. I mean, I'm not proud that my experience led me to write that, because it's kind of a grim appraisal of what the music industry is. But yeah, I think that gets to a lot of the struggles that everyone who chooses or is driven to make this part of their living.
Yes.
That's what you run up against.
But you must have been happy when you came up with those words just to describe it. It's a well-turned phrase or well-turned sentence.
Well, thank you very much.
So how long was this project in the making?
Some could argue decades.
Yes.
From the early days, and I don't know why. Maybe it's because our press releases were so entertaining, or our website was very entertaining. People have been after me for a long time to write a book about it.
Okay.
But my problem was that seemed kind of boring and limiting. A history of Bloodshot. I mean, in a lot of ways, who cares?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's very specific. It's very exclusive rather than being inclusive. So it took me a long time of thinking about it and working with a couple of editors at other presses to think about how to make it a broader story, that while my story is unique, it is also not unique, in that anyone who listens to music, anyone who loves music, can relate to a lot of what goes on here. Even though the particulars may be specific to me, everyone had that weird radio station that they loved. Everyone had that weird record store that they were able to go into and find community and solidarity and other people who would share or help you find ways to navigate the world. And when I figured that out, that's where the book really started to come together. And I used as the superstructure of the book, I went through 25 years of interviews that I had done, print or podcasts or audio recordings or whatever, and realized that all those interviews could be boiled down to a few simple and consistent questions. So using that as the superstructure of the book, I was able to weave my own biography through the development of the label and hopefully come up with something that, even if you don't know who the label is or any of the artists or even particularly care about the music, you will find something in here that you can point to and say, yeah, that's kind of my story too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it worked very well. And let's get to this story as you tell it in the book. First phase of this book, let's call it Lunchroom Loser Finds Salvation in Music, right? I think you talk about things people can relate to. I think most of us can relate to feeling out of place in middle school, not one of the cool kids. You do a great job of telling us your version of that and how you found your way to music. What I found interesting about the way you relate this part of the story, how you talk about eventually finding the music that you resonated with, is by talking a lot about the music that did not grab you. Popular music of the day, right? A lot of which is now considered classic rock. You have very strong opinions about music. You state them pretty clearly, particularly in this part of the book. Talk about how it was what you didn't like that kind of drove you or helped you realize what you did like when you finally found it. Why it was useful for you to frame your story this way.
As I went through life and talked to people and lived and all that stuff, I realized, or I saw, that a lot of people got into punk rock or got into whatever music they got into as a reaction to something or as a growth out of something. Whereas I didn't buy a Sex Pistols record because I hated Led Zeppelin. Mm-hmm. I just didn't get Led Zeppelin. I didn't get all that stuff. It filled me with a mixture of horror and boredom. And it made me feel like there was something deeply wrong with me, that music just wouldn't be a thing that I would ever understand or appreciate or enjoy in any way. And I tried really hard. And then, Layla would come on and it would never end. And it might still be going on right now. And I tell a story about how I was in shop class in junior high, which was just one of the most terrifying places a little, person of no distinction could find themselves. And I had my little model of a house made out of balsa wood. ready to go, and this guy came in, this big hairy freaky dude with a headband and stank of Oakland County ditchweed, and one of these guys who just scared the shit out of me, and he was like distraught, and he said, "Oh, Leonard Skinner was killed in a plane crash," and I just kind of innocently looked at my shopmate table guy, and I went, "Who's Leonard Skinner?" And they destroyed my model, and so it's just this like weird, frightening, immediate, random justice being meted out against the weak and the worthless. And so I would go home and be like, "Oh, let's try and listen to this Led Zeppelin," or I go to the library and check out a Leonard Skinner record, and I would just sit there and go, "This is doing nothing for me, nothing, absolutely nothing." And it didn't make me angry or whatever. It just made me like scared and sad. And so I would just go back to listening to my George Carlin records and my Monty Python records and wonder what was wrong with me.
Eventually there was a Devo show revelation.
So I would watch Saturday Night Live and Fridays, as a 12, 13, 14-year-old. And it's hard to describe to the young folk just how hard it was to see live bands.
Right.
You couldn't go onto YouTube and just see every performance of every song ever at your fingertips. You saw these bands very rarely, and I would watch Saturday Night Live, and I would see Eddie Money or whoever, and just be bored to tears, or just again a little frightened. Like this, it's just anyway. And then Devo was on, and I was like, this I get, and the Talking Heads, but then I would go into school the next Monday and be like, "Wow, did you see the Talking Heads on Saturday Night Live?" And they'd be like, "That punk rock shit, that garbage," and then I would just be like, and I'd be like, "What? Like, it's music, right?" And that is one of the weird, unique things about my story, is that I really don't have a classic rock or any kind of music period that I was turning my back on. I went from listening to Detroit Tigers baseball on AM radio and listening to George Carlin records to the Sex Pistols and X-Ray Spex and the Clash and Devo and all that. It's like one of those third world countries that goes from not having phones at all going straight to cell phones.
Yeah, I think you mentioned in the book, for someone who's had the career you have, and someone asks you about, a particular Rolling Stones record or something, and you have no idea what they're talking about.
Ask me what album any Stairway to Heaven is on.
Right.
I couldn't tell you. I still don't know. I mean, I listened to Exile on Main Street for the first time in my life about 3 months ago. So again, it's not like a hatred of this stuff. It's like, it just didn't connect to me at all.
It's a fascinating part of your story, considering how obsessed you became.
Yes.
That's the backstory. It's kind of
right. Yeah. So a lot of people assume that, you must have been surrounded by music your whole life. And it's just not the case.
Big Brother's record collection and all of that usual story. Okay. So you find Devo, you find this music, you find your people to a certain extent. The next phase of the book, I find maybe the most interesting, surprising in a way, but perhaps offers some real insight into your journey. You become obsessed with music, become involved in the field in college, eventually finding work in the business after college, right? Working on live shows in Detroit. Maybe walk us through this a bit and how it did not end well. Right?
Well, yeah. And I should also say about the book, it's not entirely linear. It kind of bounces back and forth in time, a few places between the label once it was going, and then going back to the formative years that hopefully it ties together, that how those formative years informed how I ran the label and what I wanted to accomplish in the label.
You do a much better job in the book than I'm doing trying to trace it in this podcast. Let's make that clear. But yes.
After I got involved in college radio, and so I was able to go into this room with miles of records, and they let me play what I want. And I was able to just find names that I had heard of, like Coltrane or Willie Nelson or Billie Holiday and all these things, and just dig in, just play them. My first show was 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., which that's a lot of dead time if you want. So you could just play whatever you want. And I learned so much. And then This was in Ann Arbor, University of Michigan, which was a very, very good college radio, college music town at the time. A lot of clubs, a lot of bands coming through there, REM replacements. All of them were doing really well in these small clubs. And so I started being a DJ there. The local promoters were like, hey, would you have, this unknown band out of Seattle called Nirvana on your show? Sure, I'll do that. Why not?
Yep.
And then through that, they eventually hired me as a stagehand, and I showed aptitude, and I became a stage manager, and then I became production manager, and then within a pretty short period of time, I was just doing show after show after show. Which, when I look back at the roster of the things that I saw, at the height of their, ascendancy, people like the Pixies and Jane's Addiction and Living Color and Sonic Youth, and it just went on and on. And I got to see heroes of mine like the Ramones and the Cramps and so many others. But I found myself at some point, as a production manager, you were the first one in and the last one out. So my days were 15, 16-hour days, 3-4 days a week, show after show after show. And I found that I was no longer listening to music. Music wasn't a joyful thing. It was just something that was in the way while I was doing this incredibly complex job with, looking back on it, an insane amount of responsibility. And I just got burnt out. Yeah. And I applied to graduate schools in Chicago because I liked the few times I'd visited here. And I was like, I'm going to move to Chicago and get away from music.
Yeah.
which worked out really poorly.
You were working these shows, but you weren't actually enjoying them. You just listed all these artists, but you probably don't even remember the performance.
During the show, typically, I remember 9 Inch Nails on New Year's Eve one year at a venue about, 1,500 people. And during their set, and this is just right when Head Like a Hole came out or something like that, I was asleep on a road case during their set in the back, catching up, because I still had, once the show was over, I still had 3-4 hours to go. So,
all right. So there's a move to Chicago. You think you're done with music as a career, at least at this point, right? We slowly get pulled back in. This is where it's interesting. Some time passes. Eventually, you and some friends, I'm really compressing time, put together a compilation album, a one-off or so you thought, and this is the beginning of everything that becomes Bloodshot. We're going to get to that in a second, but this is the part of the story that I think kind of fits the hero's journey archetype in some way. I forget how exactly that works, but the hero, you, Rob, start off on the noble journey, involved in the music industry, but you get waylaid. You think it's over. That's the end of your thing, right, in Michigan. But the forces out there have different plans. They cannot be ignored. Destiny is somehow involved. You get pulled back in. Do you kind of think of it this way? And maybe was burning out early important to the way you got back into a life in music?
Well, I guess that's impossible to say, but it was in the writing of the book that I really connected those dots, that I really thought long and hard about what drew me back in as a counterpoint to what pushed me away. And I saw that how connected they were. So yeah, you obviously can't have one without the other. If I loved what I was doing as a production manager, then that would have been my thing in the business, and I would have kept doing that. And I know people that did, and then I would have been one of those production guys, and I would have had to have a clip-on ponytail and a sterling silver Coke spoon medallion or something. And
are there clip-on ponytails? I didn't know those existed.
Well, there should be. And then I would have just become that guy.
Yeah.
And then there is no story here.
Yeah. Were there scars though when you were getting pulled back in that you were like wary of coming back into this industry?
No, not at all, because it happened so organically and unwittingly, and it wasn't something I was trying to make happen. Like I didn't move to Chicago to be like, oh, how can I get back in this? Right. It just happened, and then a year or two later, I find myself starting a label.
Yeah, so let's get to that now. You put out that first compilation album, which leads to a couple more releases by individual artists and more compilations. And as you tell the story in the book, and as you just mentioned, there is no master plan at this point for creating a record label. Now, as a matter of the craft of writing, I think you did a great job here of being able to put yourself back into the mindset that you had at the time, walking us through what turned out to be pivotal moments. For example, this initial compilation album story, but you don't really layer in too much reflection of how things turned out, that kind of, oh, and then I knew at that moment my life changed forever, right? That we get from like particularly bad rock and roll memoirs about like, and I got in that car and I knew that my life was changed, right? So you kind of avoid that. And it's to your credit. Was it difficult to put yourself back in those moments and kind of get in that space and write from the younger Rob's perspective?
That's interesting. No, actually it wasn't when I think about it. In the moment, and certainly in these subsequent 20 plus years that we went on, I really never did look back very often. So this was kind of the first time writing the book that I consciously did that. And I don't think it was difficult, or I certainly didn't think about it while I was doing it.
Yeah.
But that's good to know.
Final phase of this book, and as you say, it does jump back and forth, is the story of Bloodshot itself. So many ways to talk about this, but I want to make sure we cover one aspect. A big part of this book and your story of Bloodshot is a love letter to the city of Chicago, right? Particularly the Chicago of that certain time period when you've come from Detroit and are starting this label. I'm going to read a passage here where you reflect on our fair city. While many cite Nelson Algren's famous comparison of our particular patch, you're talking about Chicago here, to loving a woman with a broken nose, I imagine it as a woman who, on a first date, insisted on going for an Italian beef at a favorite spot. Practical and fearless, sloppy and determined. That's great. Talk about how you feel Chicago is so important to what you were doing at Bloodshot.
I'm glad you liked that. I remember giggling when I thought about it.
This particular quote.
Yes. About somehow yoking Nelson Algren to an Italian beef sandwich. I'm pretty pleased with that.
Well, there's a lot of food talk in this book, so it makes sense.
And there is a lot of food talk in this because, again, that was part of the impetus to give the book a universality. And to me, independent labels, independent bands are cut from the same cloth as like craft brewers or small distilleries or the independent diner or the weird little mom and pop neighborhood record stores or bookstores or you know, my favorite Thai place or things like that. It's all part of a landscape of how to live in a city and the joys that are inherent in that.
Mm-hmm.
This is early 90s when I moved to Chicago. And at that time, and no disrespect to my hometown and the people that didn't leave, but a lot of people did. There is such a large Detroit expat community
in Chicago.
All the traffic on I-94 was coming one way.
Yeah.
For people who wanted to live in a city that had some vibrancy to it, but also that, you know, if you're a bone deep Midwesterner, you're not going to move to LA or wherever. And that's not just true of Detroit. It's also true of St. Louis and Milwaukee and Des Moines and Frankenmuth or Joliet. It's like Chicago was the Midwestern magnet at that time for creative folks who wanted to create in an environment out of the glare of the coasts or things like that. And when I came here, the idea of doing something as insane as starting a label didn't seem that insane. It was just that labels were all over the place. People just did them. Touch and Go, Feel Good All Over, Thrill Jockey, Minty Fresh. I mean, I looked around and there would be all these bands playing at the Empty Bottle, Lounge Acts, wherever, that were on local labels.
Yeah.
And these weren't rarefied businesses dictating tastes and norms and trends from up high. It was like there's a ratty storefront or there's a guy's kitchen table or whatever. That's a label.
Yes. And you're saying this is a particularly Chicago thing.
It was that energy at the time.
Yeah.
Where, you know, again, when I left Detroit, there wasn't that energy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people, when they came here, were just surprised at how wide open it was, that you could fail and then try something else. And it wasn't that big of a deal because rents were low and neighborhoods were wide open. There were stages everywhere. No one promoter ran the town. So you could just get away with weird stuff and not be afraid to fail. I mean, I think I say in the book that failure never occurred to me because it didn't seem like that would be that big of a deal, because success didn't really seem like it would happen either. So if you're not worrying about succeeding, then why would you be worried about failing?
Right. It was also a city of neighborhoods and local establishments that you referred to just now.
Mm-hmm.
That was
I don't think Bloodshot, and I've said this forever, that Bloodshot could not have thrived in any other city.
Yeah.
If we had been in some other town that had, and that's funny, I just caught myself calling Chicago a town, which speaks to the small nature of it.
Yeah.
But something like Nashville or New York or LA, where there would be rules or hierarchies to starting such a business, pre-existing models, we didn't have that. We just did it what felt right. And to marry country roots with punk rock energy is something that would have been not allowed in those things, or utterly dismissed. Whereas here, Sue and Julia, who own Lounge Acts, were like, sure, here, have our stage. You know, Bruce at the Empty Bottle. Yeah, come on in. We'll do this. And it was just this kind of community energy that it made anything seem like it was possible.
Yeah. Okay, you're leading to my next question. We can't talk about the Bloodshot story without getting into a discussion of genre or category, which is most of the time not a productive way to talk about music. But let me quote the book here. The love of what was between the genres and below the mainstream had seeped into my bones. Where most wanted slots and categories, I was drawn to bridges, interstices, and webs. Right? So when Bloodshot started attracting the attention, the industry, of course, tried to categorize what you were doing. You kind of had to come up with something as a marketing tool to describe what it was you were doing. Take this question anywhere you want, but how categories and genres conceptually relate to what was going on at Bloodshot and what you were drawn to or what you're trying to draw attention to musically.
How long is this podcast?
Well, we got time.
Well, it becomes a matter of practical necessity to come up with a name to help guide people who might not be as reflexively open-minded to things that are not easily categorized. And we knew that it would be much more beneficial to come up with a name on our own than let somebody else come up with something awful or nondescriptive. So we came up with Insurgent Country.
Insurgent Country.
And that was, the C word carried a lot of heavy baggage back then. And people who were purportedly open-minded about independent music would see that C word and immediately dismiss it. And we're talking in an era, pre-internet and stuff, where country meant Billy Ray Cyrus or Reba McEntire. And why would you like country music? I didn't like country music. I didn't know much about it either. So you had to, we tagged Insurgent in front of it to give something of a pass to people to enjoy it or to explore it. But personally, it became a bit of a millstone pretty quickly because then now you have a name, you have a genre tag, and everyone wants to fit things into that. Whereas music, and again, this goes back to maybe me not knowing anything about different kinds of music. I just liked what I heard. So if going back to things like bands like X, I didn't know I didn't know Billy Zoom was playing Chuck Berry riffs. I didn't know that John Doe was a country adjacent singer. I just heard what I liked. So I liked what I heard. So putting things in those boxes, it never really interested me personally. So when we signed Andre Williams, people were like, well, that's not Bloodshot material. very quickly people are like, well, that's not a Bloodshot band. That's not the Bloodshot sound. I was like, the hell it is. It's whatever the fuck I say it is, it kind of, but you have to give kind of, you have to ease people into things at times. And then,
but it wasn't random. There was a coalescing around certain types of sound.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't random. Like no one was going to hand us a Kraftwerk record with a banjo on it and go here. And,
right.
So yeah, we did have to, and that was more of a, how do you stand out from the hundreds of other independent labels that were just blossoming everywhere, all over the country at that time. I mean, the mid to late 90s, that was just the golden era of independent labels, just doing well and thriving and cropping up. So we did keep a kind of stylistic leash on things to a certain degree, but just to stand out from the other labels.
I think you do kind of talk about this in the book a little bit, but looking back, it seems natural what you did in bringing some of these different influences together, the way these artists brought these different influences together. And I think you used some reference about chocolate and peanut butter, the Hershey, the Reese's peanut butter cup, but it was always kind of there in Hank Williams and, punk and country.
Right.
There was always something there that was
you had to have something, but very quickly people decided what could and couldn't be in that. Like there were legitimate or quote unquote authentic ways to do this. And
once you create a category, then people want to make it something.
And which that makes me very bored and hostile very quickly. And there were a lot of people early on who were like that. Well, that record doesn't sound like the old 97s. And I'm like, well, it's not, because it's not the old 90s. We're not going to put out that one old 97s record over and over and over again. And some people were surprised by that. So when we released the Robbie Folks record, which was like straight up 50s honky tonk, people were like, well, that's not a Bloodshot record. And I'm like, it's looking back, it's like one of the, tent pegs of Bloodshot records. And, when Alejandro Escovedo we signed him, they were like, that's not it was for my own mental health as much as anything else that I had to keep pushing boundaries and keep hearing these elements and tropes and sounds that I was hearing in certain aspects of country music and roots music, that just because it didn't sound like these other things, this very narrow view of it, that doesn't mean that there's not room for expanding it.
Right.
I mean, that would get very boring very quickly.
The compilation record was a big part of Bloodshot history, right? I mean, you issued a lot of these. Talk about those and what they meant to the operation.
I'm glad you asked me about that, because that was a chapter that I had and that I'd had written originally, and that once I stopped being involved with the label, I excised it because it really wasn't relevant anymore. But I always loved doing compilation records, either thematic or just 5, 10, 15, 20 year anniversary records, because it gave the artist a chance to do something a little bit out of their normal cycle of recording.
Yeah.
Yeah. It wasn't something that maybe would fit into their overall sound, but they would love to do it, or they loved the theme that we had done. And it also allowed us to introduce other people that maybe weren't entirely Bloodshot material, but that we liked as people and musicians. So this was a chance to give them some exposure.
Yeah.
They were always a lot of fun to put together. They always came together fairly easily. And there was also a general looseness to them that some people who were like maybe very super particular about their recording process or got a little, the artistic bent in them.
Yep.
This was something they could just go in and knock out in a couple of days and have a blast doing it. And so you get a kind of a different side of the artist as well.
Yeah. There's so many great anecdotes in this book. The cast of characters involved is never ending. People like John Langford, Nico Case, Robbie Folks, you already mentioned, Split Lip Rayfield, Justin Townes Earl. The list goes on and on. You probably had trouble deciding how to narrow down the stories that are in this book. You've led a very rich life with such a network of fascinating, creative people. I mean, you wrote this book about it, but do you often reflect on what that means to you and the life you've led, to have spent decades in this world you created, peopled by this endless stream of characters?
I think about it, yeah, it's been incredible. And again, I didn't really think about it in the moment. There would be times where I remember being at a Polish restaurant on Milwaukee Avenue with Dave Alvin of X and the Blasters and Knitters, and just kind of going, I'm at a table with Dave Allen eating potato pancakes. Or when Wanda Jackson, the queen of rockabilly, physically pushed aside some major label weasel at a panel in Austin at South by Southwest so that she could give me a big lipsticky smack on my cheek and call me doll. I mean, I got to meet so many of my musical heroes. Some of them got to record on our label. There was one time when 3 people that I have so many of their records already, that I'd already had their records on my shelves for decades. Dex Romweber of the Flat Duo Jets, Barence Whitfield of Barence Whitfield and the Savages, and Andre Williams were all in the office at the same time. And I just kind of walked out of my, little hole in the wall office and just was thinking, this is unbelievable. And to me, it is very humbling to be a part of this continuum of music. Because I hopped in at some point not knowing what I was doing. I didn't have a paddle. I barely had a canoe. And what it brought to me was, just a fascinating ride and so much joy and community, that to be able to pay that back, to put out these records, to help these people in their career, to help other people in their career go forward. I mean, I'm not in the racket anymore, but somebody else is going to pick up that gauntlet and just be part of this continuum. And that's what nourishes the whole underground scene and independent music. And it was what I hope. And in the end of the book, I think is a call to appreciate independent creative communities and support them, because they will go away with astonishing speed if we don't pay attention to them or take them for granted. So the thrill for me is just knowing that I was a part of that.
Yeah. Do you think hanging out with these people shaped you as a creative person, say as someone who might write a book? Do you think you picked up and became a more or a different kind of creative from being with them and working with them?
I think it's such a different process and mindset. Musicians create, and the turnaround time is a little quicker, and then you get that immediate feedback. You play a song, you're in front of a crowd, you get that feedback. This is months, years of sitting in a room by yourself with just you and your, usually your worst enemy, my own brain, and hammering this out. And then you submit it, and then months later it comes out, and then you get to do things like this. Yes. And so it's a different sense of gratification. It's definitely a different skill set.
Yep.
I'm sure I did glean something from this, maybe just the importance of what it meant to people to be up close to it all those years, because some of these people, they're artists, they're difficult to get along with, and people sometimes sanitize or mythologize who they are as people. But so when people say, oh my God, this guy is so great, I love him so much, I'm like, this guy's kind of a prick, actually. But I don't, I tamp that down. I swallow that thought, because to them, it doesn't matter.
Yep.
It's what that music meant in that moment. And I've seen rooms transformed by music, and there's nothing more kind of ennobling than to think that you had a part in that.
Yeah. You said something earlier. There's a quote here from the book. I want to dig in on that just a little bit more if you can. We were talking about the parting message from the book. And the quote is this: "It was through the nurturing of an innovative community that independence would thrive, and vice versa." On the face of it, this is maybe contradictory, right? Independence through community. But talk about what you meant there and the message of that.
Well, you can be only so independent without anyone, if no one's paying attention. But if you're doing things within the community And I always thought of Bloodshot as a community label, as we were part of the community. We were not a part from the community. If you live in a neighborhood and you don't want a giant chain store coming in, you make the decision to support the local record store. You make a point to go to the local independent bookstore. These are the actions that we can take, that you're part of a community that believes in independence. But without those people who want to be independent, then that community could easily go away.
Yep.
And we're left with Texas Roadhouse on every street corner and, whatever corp running every store.
Whatever Corp.
And
That's one of our sponsors, actually.
oh, really? Oh,
It's a division of Globochem. I got to ask you if you want to give your radio show a plug. Tell us about your radio show, Rob.
well, I do a radio show. The first time I got involved in college radio, and it was just so much fun to just play records. And then I eventually moved on to a rockabilly show, and then an R&B soul show called the Friday Night Fish Fry. And it was the first time that doing radio was the first time I felt like you could advocate for musicians for a certain thing. You could play records, and it was also a great way to discover things. And about 15, 20 years ago, there was a low wattage station in Southwest Michigan that a friend of mine was part of and asked if I wanted to do a show. And I've been doing it ever since. It's called Miller's Cave. It's on WRHC FM, 106.7 FM on your radio dial, but streaming worldwide at radioharborcountry.org. And I just play all my weird roots records that don't normally get played. And that's every Saturday, 4 to 5 p.m. Eastern time, and replayed every Sunday,
Awesome.
9 to 10 p.m.
I look forward to checking it out. One reason I look forward to checking it out is in your book, which I now hold in my hand, you have these great, what are they?
Appendices?
Appendices, thank you. In the back, one of them is letters to Bloodshot, which is hilarious. You've had some interesting fans over the years, so I'll just leave it at that. But another one is a list of playlists from when you DJ'd at clubs or whatever, of these great old country songs, or, I'm categorizing things again. But I read these lists of these songs, and it's such a great playlist. I'm going to go make my own version of this
Well, good.
playlist so I can enjoy it, because I'm like, oh, that's a great song. That's a great song. I haven't thought about that song, and there's songs on here I don't know. So I'm going to make my own playlist from this, but also I'm going to listen to your radio show.
Well, thank you.
For more of
And
that.
look, those are, I found some old cassette tapes of when I was DJing at Delilah's. Before that, it was called the Crash Palace on Lincoln Avenue in Lincoln Park. And that was kind of the laboratory. Why did I just go English here?
That's fancy.
Laboratory. That was where I could play a lot of these weird records on country night at a punk bar, and people would be like, well, the Minutemen aren't country. Mm-hmm. And I'd be like, well, but this song Corona is country. And then I could play that next to the Osborne Brothers and people. And so it was just this testing ground of, does this work? I could play the Cramps next to Dolly Parton, and people were like, yeah, it makes sense. So I found these cassettes, and I put a couple of the playlists in the back of the book. And
they're a great list because, like you said, yeah, exactly right. There's these old country songs, and then these songs from the later era by other bands. I'm like, and they do. Just even seeing the names together, I think in my head, I guess that would work together.
And some of it seems more obvious now than it did back then.
Right.
Because
of you.
Well,
Bloodshot.
If I did anything in this world, it's that I destigmatize the two things coming together. But at the time, people would be like, you can't play country music at a punk bar. Or you can't, these things don't mix, or how do you, and now I think people are more accepting of the idea, and it's just part of the landscape now. It's not even a weird thing particularly.
Yes. One of the things you just said reminds me, the music I listen to now, my tastes and how they are the things I reach for, I realized were shaped by what you were doing at Bloodshot, even if it wasn't directly, because like you said, they seem obvious now, but you're supporting these artists and putting it out there and allowing these people to do what they want and shedding light on these artists that were in the in-between spaces, made it okay and gave them that platform. And now people listen to this stuff and they don't even know who you are.
Yeah.
But they will when they read your book.
Well, hope so.
Well done, Rob.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for taking the time to sit down. I really enjoyed this
So
conversation.
did I. It was a lot of fun. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah. The hours are long, but the pay is low. A Curious Life in Independent Music by Rob Miller. Everybody go grab it.
Please.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
I'm gonna tell you what, I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna tell you what.